about civil rights. First off, this is a little gram they put online, and every time that something's mentioned, it gets a bigger word, and you can tell the two biggest words that we think about civil rights is equality and Martin Luther King Jr. I found this pretty impactful of civil rights because there's a lot of big things going on here. Down from the marches to the Kent State in Vietnam to the I Have a Dream speech to the Native Americans to Malcolm X, women's rights, Rosa Parks being arrested, Brown versus the Board of Education, Cesar Chavez, the sit-ins, etc. So, I'm divided into 4 time periods. We're first going to focus 1865 to 1929, secondly 1930 to 1957, 1958 to 1964, and 1965 to current. So, to review 1865 to 1929, you should have already had this, but we're going to go through it very quick. In 1865, they passed the 13th Amendment, which did exactly what you see here. It outlawed slavery. Remember, Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. The president does not have that power. To amend the Constitution, it must be done by Congress. So, not by a president. That's an important thing. And so, yes, I know there's executive orders, but different time. Now, what to do with these now? Millions of freed people. Well, 2 groups had different ways. The KKK was started, and it was to scare the now freed slaves into submission working for them. The other group was called the Freedmen's Bureau, and they wanted to do things to protect the Freedmen's Bureau. You can tell the government jumping in the middle here, right? Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, the biggest thing they wanted was protection of rights and some way of making them a citizen. And although the Freedmen's Bureau will eventually go away, they did achieve just that. In 1868, the 14th Amendment is passed, and as you can see, no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the law. Equal protection of the law being a big phrase, coming back maybe to haunt in a little while. So now, if you go back to the way I remember them, we've set them free, we gave them rights, etc. The last thing we must do is we must allow them to vote. Voting is the biggest way to show that you care about your country, that you want to affect change, or that you agree with the way it's going. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are referred to as the Civil War Amendments. What did we get out of the Civil War? We set them free, we gave them rights, and we let them vote. And that is talking about black males, right? Because remember, women in general cannot. Now also in 1870, Hiram Revels becomes the first black senator, and he is from the good old state of Mississippi, which is kind of unique considering that everyone sees Mississippi as maybe still being racist, yet the first black senator came from here. So what is that saying? Right? Now, even though he is there, he doesn't have a lot of powers. There are 3 methods of what we call disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement, if you remember, means to discourage someone from doing something. In this case, they wanted to discourage black males from voting. Way number 1 was a poll tax. And quite simply, if you could not pay, you could not vote. Now, it's important to note that this was not only aimed at black males, but also poor white males who could affect the social order, the way things were done. Anytime you affect someone's money or their power, they fight back. The second way, we looked at this in class, it's called a literacy test, and as we saw, you can read it perfectly fine, but can you complete it to how it wants? And that's the thing, it's kind of like an idiot test, an IQ test, whatever you want to call it. And so this will do that. And again, this was for poor white voters as well. And the last one, the most insidious one, was called the grandfather clause, which basically said whatever status your grandfather had in life, so did you. So if he was a slave, you were considered a slave and thereby not allowed to vote. I know I'm going through this quick, but we've already talked about all these. Now, no one in the North really knew what was going on here. And so the mother of the civil rights movement, meaning the person who wanted to affect change and get people raised up correctly, is Ida B. Wells. And you can see on the back tree there's a noose. Ida B. Wells wrote a book describing the Southern lynch law, or the Southern lynch horrors, and the fact that there was no lynch law. And she will be chased from the South up to Chicago. So this is what she was talking about here, lynching. And this is a horrible thing. I mean, you can even see this person is actually smiling. It's kind of unusual, isn't it? There was the bell. Now, 2 people who wanted to affect change in the correct way. We had Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. So we're going to get into Booker T first and talk about it. Now, Booker T, if you remember, he had something called the Atlanta Compromise, where he told the poor former slaves to cast down their bucket where you are, learn a trade, and be useful to their former masters. The white people loved this. In fact, he's the first African American invited to the White House because Teddy Roosevelt saw him as a way of keeping this alive. Okay. So he had that, and he called it gradualism. That basically meant that making yourself useful through vocational training or learning a skill would eventually pay dividends in the end once people saw that you were a useful need. Now, what it actually did is it scared them back into the only thing they knew how to do is farm, but they didn't know how to take care of it. And it scared them back into, if you remember, the sharecropper cycle of poverty. You got land and seed, half your crop. You bought food and clothing on credit. You planted and harvested. You gave the landowner stuff to sell, and in the end, you actually owed more than what you earned. So you had a very good thing. And this is a perpetual cycle of poverty. It's never going to end. There's not a way out. Okay? And so there is that. Now, I had you look in class at some black codes, and if you're not in class, it's on page 2 through 5 in your packet about the ways that these former slaves were expected to act. Now, these are codes, meaning it's kind of like it's an honor code. They're not really enforced. One of these codes said that whites and blacks could not sit in the same railroad car. Well, Homer Plessy challenged this. He was arrested. He thought it was civil disobedience. He was arrested for breaking and causing a disturbance. And so in the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, when he sues the railroad company, the major question is, can you have separate facilities? Their decision here was that yes, you could based on race if, by the letter of the law, the 14th Amendment was enforced and it had equal protection. Hence, we are given the phrase separate but equal. So they took the black codes of separate, combined them with the constitutional protection of equal protection of the 14th Amendment. Now, the problem is they had no problem making them separate. They had a little bit of a problem making them equal. Okay? So separate but equal says that you can have separate facilities based on race as long as they allow equal protection of the law or the 14th Amendment. Now, we have two types of segregation. The first one is gone. It's called de jure. De jure means enforced by the law. If you broke this, right, you would be arrested by this guy because he is operating under what is a law. If you remember, separate equal allowed the growth of Jim Crow laws. The black codes have now been called laws because the officers are allowed to enforce it. And this was nationwide, not just the South. Okay? The second type of segregation exists today. It's called de facto segregation. And de facto segregation, where you segregate yourself based on custom or tradition or what you're accustomed to doing. We see this today in school cafeterias and in churches and barbershops and a lot of different things, possibly even too in occupations with teachers or cops. And it's not because they're being forced to, it's because it's a custom. And that's something there. As I said, these are called Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow laws are designed to separate. They're designed to segregate the two societies. They did not want these two societies to mix. They thought it would create a mongrelization or a graying. But what we learned when it went away is that it actually taught these younger children that they were less than somebody else. And so that's ultimately why it's going to go away, and we'll talk about that in the Brown case tomorrow. Now, beginning in 1910, there is a mass migration where the people left the South of sharecropping and Jim Crow and moved to the North. Now, this was not because there was no segregation up there. Remember, separate equals nationwide. However, there are very few Jim Crow laws. So they moved up to the North in search of jobs, if you remember that, right? This is during industrialization. And the first Great Migration lasts from 1910 until 1920. And then we have a second one. So here's a painting, very famous painting called The Great Migration. You can see the towns, and you can definitely tell the people are black, and they're going through these portals to get to their places. All right. Now, in 1909, the NAACP is founded, and if you notice, it was by W.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells, and a couple of white people. And in fact, we have 2 women as well, so that's quite shocking. But NAACP stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And as I've told you before, you're looking at their scale of jurisprudence here, right? They are going to use court systems and the law or the Constitution to prove it inherently wrong. Now, one guy who kind of got to start before this was W.B. Du Bois. He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk and the Talented 10, a couple of books there. But what he's about is, he's about higher education. He said if we went through higher education, people would see that segregation is wrong and it doesn't do anything but separate. It has nothing to do with being equal. And so he will preach it on those grounds, and he highly disagrees with Booker T. Washington. Okay? Now, in 1914, we get a third voice in this equality. His name is Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey did want equality for blacks. Now, he's also a separatist, meaning he actually likes separate equal, and in a very weird way, actually agree with the KKK. So, what does he want? He wants a separate society. He creates what is called the UNI, the United Negro Improvement Association, and this was to create a separate society in America. When that did not work, Garvey and the UNI came up with the idea of what is called as the Back to Africa movement. Now, Liberia had been purchased by the United States after the Civil War as a place for former slaves to go in case they wanted. Garvey is going to encourage this, saying not only is it just Liberia will flood all of Africa, and he would be the king naturally, right? Now, this doesn't work out for a couple of reasons. Number one, Liberia is a pretty small country. You're not going to fit 7 million people in it. And number two, some people liked where they were and liked their home, and they didn't want to leave where they had been accustomed to being. Now, what hastens civil rights in the 1920s was music, the Jazz Age. Jazz was about racial tolerance because the best jazz musicians have to be black. So if you're going to go listen to them, inherently you're saying that your skin's not important. I just want to listen to what makes me dance. So jazz is an instrument of racial tolerance and helps to speed these things up. The Jazz Age is part of a much bigger period of history called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is the flowering of African American culture. That means the Great Migration put these people there, and through the great methods that they had of the right time, the right environment, jazz, etc., they flowered into these beautiful flowers. And the flowers were literature, music, art, writing, all these different things, okay? And so that was the Harlem Renaissance. We went over that in the 1920s. Now, as I told you, we have the incorrect assumption that separate but equal is out in the North. And if that was the case, surely we would have a black member of Congress prior to this. But the first black member of Congress is Oscar De Priest in 1929. So that shows us that inherently there is still some ill will, different things like that. Now, tomorrow we're going to talk about 1930s until 1957 and a lot more things there that are interesting. All right?